Greetings, intrepid listeners. Adorable, cuddly, humble, and fierce September 6er Paul Toscano generously agreed to team up with me to bring you a bumper Christmas hamper of brain food. On each of the 12 days of Christmas, Mormonism's little helpers will deliver to you a conversation about one of the big ideas or controversies in the theology of Mormonism. In my opinion, you are never stupid to have found the big ideas in this religion interesting, inspiring, and a launching point or guide by the side as you consider for yourself what on earth is the meaning and purpose of life, the universe, and everything. Is there a God? What kind of a person is a God? What does that God want from us or for us? Does Christianity or Mormonism have anything useful to say about this, or is it all a big distraction? Are their doctrines mind expanding or thought stopping? Since we can't get intellectually and spiritually fed on their starvation rations, we have to look elsewhere to have these conversations. And wonderfully, there have always been heroes like Paul Toscano willing to keep up the fight for making Mormonism much more interesting again, or Mamma Mia for short. Undaunted by betrayals, persecution, excommunication, and skepticism, he has fought the good fight, published the books, perambulated the podcasts, and kept fanning the flickering flame of hope that the better ideas in Joseph Smith's theology could make Christianity healthier and more rational, and that the Mormon religion could still stop ignoring or breaking the treasures it has inherited. It was a very rare privilege to chew on some of these big ideas with Paul and hear about some of his first-hand interactions and experiences trying to persuade the prophets and apostles of LDS Mormonism to raise their game. As always, Mormon civil war is not just about robust and valid critical analysis of why the church we love is spiraling down a plug hole towards oblivion, but also offering pathways out of that early grave. In these conversations, we grapple with the most fundamental concepts that would have to be resolved of all regarding things like the 5 or 6 different versions of the Godhead that LDS Mormonism has been running with, and what Jesus' atonement and grisly death was actually accomplishing. Brace yourselves. It's Christmas. I'm going to sing. On the 3rd day of Christmas, Paul Toscano said to me, imagination versus fantasy, idealism versus physicalism, and Mormonism versus Christianity. All right. Oh my gosh, there's some groovy stuff here. I don't know what any of it means. I'll mostly try not to interrupt. All right. So, welcome back, everyone. We are now in our 3rd installment, our 3rd day of Christmas, talking about the theme of imagination versus fantasy. Now, I am an art teacher, and literally being imaginative is part of the assessment criteria for doing well at GCSE and A-level art in our secondary schools here. So I'm super excited for this one and whatever twist Paul is going to be putting on this idea. For me, imagination and fantasy is exactly the same thing, so I've no idea what he's on about. Let's find out and dive in. So go for it, Paul. What on earth do you mean?
Well, here's how I divide the concept of imagination and fantasy, both of which I consider to be good. But there's a difference. Imagination and fantasy are like 2 hemispheres of one globe. And imagination, when we think of imaginative works, we're talking about, I think imagination invites evidence. It is not hostile to evidence. It wants evidence. And examples of imaginative things are, the general and special theories of relativity were products of the imagination. Mathematics is entirely a product of the imagination. the ordinate, the abscissa, and the other line, the z line that comes out at you, is all imaginative. It's the Cartesian coordinates. It's a product of the imagination. It is not fantasy in the sense that it's not like a unicorn that doesn't exist. It looks for evidence and it finds evidence to support the imaginative product. There couldn't have been iPhones without the imagination. They couldn't have been. So cosmology and quantum physics, mathematics, all are products of the imagination, as are artwork and music and Bach and, Taylor Swift. It's all products of the imagination that we're dealing. But the difference I make between the one side of imagination and fantasy is that fantasy ignores, or at least seems to operate indifferent to evidence. So if I'm a novelist, and when I write a novel, if I want it to be read and I want it to be good, it has to be grounded in the real world. And I take C.S. Lewis's admonition that if you're going to write a fantastical novel, water still has to run downhill. I mean, you can't. If you break rules, and a lot of the movies today that are built on video games tend to not have clear rules, that's why they're not interesting. Whereas the more they are grounded in rules, like Tolkien's, The Lord of the Rings, and C.S. Lewis, when they wrote, and the Inklings wrote, they were grounded. They had sparse supernatural grounded in a great deal of the natural world. So, so you have to. It has to be, fantasy has to be grounded in reality, but it doesn't have to invite evidence. It's fine. It can go off. Poetry, lyric poetry, it can go on, but it has to. So it doesn't necessarily have to invite the evidence, but it has to be. Now let's take the flat earthers, for example. These group of people believe the earth is flat, or kind of, it's shaped like a cone and has a dome over it, and the moon and the star and the moon and the sun kind of twirl around it in the dome at the top of the dome. I don't believe it, okay? But I can tell you that if I'm standing in a giant parking lot, the earth does look flat. From that limited perspective, it does look flat. The problem with the flat earthers is not that they don't have a perception of truth. It's just that it's an extremely limited truth. And when they admit evidence, it's only evidence that supports the hypothesis. It's not evidence that contradicts it. And I see this in science also. In science, there's, they spent 40 years on string theory, pumping, billions of dollars into string theory. And the reality is they haven't come up with any real solid evidence of it. And so, you can keep doing that, or you have to move on to a different hypothesis. And that's hard for people invested in a particular hypothesis to give up. I mean, the germ theory was, had to replace the theory of the night vapors. And so long as doctors believed in the night vapors, they weren't going to wash their hands. But when they finally realized that they were little tiny microbes that were causing diseases, they started to wash their hands. But it took a while to overthrow the old paradigm with a new paradigm. But there's a tendency in the universities these days that people invested in a particular point of view, who've gotten grants for a particular worldview or a particular hypothesis, they don't want to give it up. Their career has been made on it. So there's a tendency to fight back. And so sometimes things have to proceed by funerals. The old guard has to die off. That's what happens in Mormonism. The old apostles have to die off, and then it slowly moves forward based on funerals.
It's not quick enough.
So what I want to talk about here about imagination and fantasy is that religion or theology is a work of the imagination. The way we picture God, the way we, you came up at the beginning, you said, when we were talking about the King Follett discourse, you said, well, there's the theory that there's an eternal regression of divinities, but then, is there a Christ for every world, or is there an Adam for every world, or did God really, how many worlds does the atonement cover? And, and I the whole
How many
that
angels can dance on the head of a pin?
right, theology
It's the old
always
sort of,
gets
yeah,
bogged down
yeah,
in that. And that's why
yeah,
I think, I say over and over again, look, theology can't save us. Love saves
mm,
us. Theologies
mm,
can be harmful or they can be helpful. And we have to try to give up the theologies that are harmful, like
mm,
polygamy and polygyny and polyandry. But then we've got to look at, is polytheism helpful or is it harmful? Well,
mm,
I think it's, frankly, I'm a polytheist. I make a difference between an uncreated divinity like God and
mm,
created divinities like we will be when we are made like unto
mm,
God. I make a difference
mm,
there, but I'm saying, yeah, we're part of
mm,
God, like
mm,
Joseph Smith said. I agree with it.
mm,
I understand this King Follett discourse a little bit, differently than most people do because I
mm,
ground it differently, but I may be wrong.
mm,
But there's ways to look at things. So theology has to be ongoing and it has to seek to be love centered and not harsh, but it doesn't save.
mm,
What saves is our love of God and each other and our
mm.
desire to maybe even sacrifice for the benefit of other people, where we take less so other people can have more.
Yeah. And I
And
think
so,
that's the basis of religion. The anthropologists would say religion evolved in human civilization. And I've taught this, I was teaching religious education in our school along with philosophy and stuff for a long time, and trying to kind of get down to the basics and talk about, what's the practical purpose of religion if you look at it objectively. And it is, the message from the anthropologists is you cannot have a human community survive in numbers more than around 100 people, like a reasonably extended family clan, without some kind of higher philosophy or shared identity that people are still willing to die for, in the way that they die for their own children, to protect and serve them and prioritize them. Therefore, you have to have an ideology for civilization scale up from tiny hunter-gatherer extended family groups into farming communities and towns and cities and nation states and empires. That with all of those systems, you have to have a shared ideology, whether it's political or usually religious, in order to organize power, in order to give people a sense of reward for sacrificing themselves for the leaders or the greater community. Um, and that therefore we make God in our own image, usually while going about that, to serve that survival function. That's in a nutshell the skeptical or secular view of what religion is. And it also helps us to manage our fear of death, so that you're willing to go into battle and fight for the tribe and die if necessary, because you think you're going to Valhalla afterwards. And or you can just cope with being an ape with a pretty primitive monkey, but with enough intelligence to really worry about what you're going to lose when you die. Therefore, religion helps you just cope day to day rather than giving up and becoming a nihilist. So that for me then is the idea of the imagination. That imagination plays a role, that it's still, in a sense, it's not complete nonsense. It's imagining or thinking about what is going on in the world, observing, science being an act of imagination, of understanding, maths being an act of trying to, putting numbers to things that are real and can be calculated. Um, that religion of any kind, if it survives, by definition works on some level. It may be not beneficial for some groups in society, but overall it kind of benefits more than it kills, or maybe it just kills a lot of people but somehow perpetuates. That's the Darwinian environment, all these competing factions and ideas and dynamics playing out on what survives, what works. And at the moment, LDS Mormonism is being killed off extremely fast in a very ruthless Darwinian competition, because it's become too weak to survive in the environment of free access to information it finds itself in. and the leaders are not able to adapt quickly enough to changes in that environment, for the
Well,
reasons we've talked about before, that we don't have democracy and we don't have accountability. So you just have a dying oligarchy of very geriatric, stubborn old men who don't know what they're doing most of the time, if ever.
yeah, I think
So
one of the
so
things
is
that
your view?
Jesus,
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
one of the things that Jesus did, just to
Mm, mm,
for back up what you're saying, is that
yeah.
one of his great achievements was to take a tribal god of
Mm,
war and turned it into a cosmic god of love.
mm,
And
mm.
what Mormonism it
And some
starts
people
out.
argue that the Jews did that first. You know, you mentioned Zoroastrianism in an earlier episode, which was the ancient Babylonian religion, which is seen as the first monotheistic religion historically, and kind of a precursor for a lot of Judaism. But you know, if you can read the Old Testament, and there's a lot in there of, saying your purpose is to benefit the whole world, not just your tribe. That your God is the universal God, not a tribal competing God. I mean, there's still loads of carnage and genocide in the Old Testament, of course, but at least as a concept, it's already there for Jesus to work with, and he quotes Leviticus a lot and
Oh,
so on.
absolutely.
Um,
The Old
yeah,
Testament
yeah,
is not simply tribalism. It's more
mm,
nuanced than that.
yeah,
By the time
yeah,
Jesus is born,
mm,
Jehovah was seen by certainly the leadership of the Jews at the time as a
mm,
tribal god,
yeah.
and
They'd
and
returned it
uh,
to its worst
and
aspect. Yeah,
your
yeah,
connection to God was through the tribe.
mm,
And that's
mm,
true of Mormonism today. Your connection to God is
mm,
through the tribe of the
mm,
righteous, which is what Mormonism
mm,
has become. And
yeah,
we have to leave that. Because Jesus
mm,
did not die for the tribe. He died for every
mm,
single individual. And the individualization that grows out of the teachings of Jesus transformed Western civilization. Because even though there's a lot of nuance in the Greek literature, so the Odyssey and the Iliad and others, which suggests that, people could see themselves apart from their tribe, but still the tribe
mm,
dominated and people identified themselves as part of the tribe. People are doing that again now. You identify as gay, or you identify as straight, or uh,
mm,
transitioning, or you identify as Democrat, or identify as Republican, or MAGA,
mm,
or you identify as
mm.
monarchist or anti-monarchist in England,
Mm,
or
vegetarian.
yeah,
Yeah.
vegetarian.
Mm,
That idea gives some comfort to people, but it's short-lived. Uh,
mm, mm,
what Our relationship is not to God through an intercessory priesthood or through some tribal concept or some group concept. Our connection to God is direct, and people are terrified by that direct. They may not want it because it seems like God is going to judge us and beat us or something. They have the wrong idea of God that was
mm,
actually promulgated by the tribe, which is wrong.
mm,
It's God loves us as a child is loved by a loving parent. And it's hard for us to believe that because we're so guilt ridden. And that's sad. But the message of God is love, that he loves us and wants us to
mm,
love him or her, because I think it's both. And so,
mm,
yeah, I think the idea of a tribal God is, I mean, I think what you're saying is absolutely 100% true. The identities that we seek an identity with some group, and then it's downhill from there, and we
mm,
become slaves of our own guilt and selfishness.
mm. So if you could be clear, what do you mean by fantasy then, as a sort of
Fantasies
a
are works of
negative
the
category?
imagination. Fantasies
Mm,
are works of the imagination that really are not relying on or inviting evidence. And they could be as
mm,
silly as the flat earthers, or as silly as people who dismiss UFOs in spite of all the evidence that there is for them and don't want to even consider that. There's a
mm,
recent series of events that happened in the last few weeks here in the United States where in New Jersey, people have witnessed literally hundreds of UFOs. They're called
Drones.
drones.
Or
And
yeah.
the head of the Secretary of Homeland Security came out and said, "Oh, there's nothing to see here." And yesterday there was a big news cast that came up where the sheriffs of the counties and the mayors have gotten together in a group and had a press conference on television where they said the Secretary of Homeland Security is an idiot. We have seen these. We've seen this. We have one constabulary reporting that they saw 50 of these drones coming from the ocean. We need to know whether these are a security threat. Are they from private enterprises? Are they government? Are they foreign? Are they intergalactic? We don't care what they are, but don't tell us we haven't seen them, and don't tell us there's nothing to see here, that it's all usual. Maybe we've we've said that we sighted an airplane and we mistook it. No, that's not what's happening here. We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of citizens who've reported these things, and we need help. And so the idea that
where
you
is
can
that happening in Mormonism?
dismiss evidence. I'm talking about evidence here. And so one of the things I want to say about evidence is historians tend to have a problem with evidence. Now, I was a lawyer, and I was a courtroom lawyer, even though I was in bankruptcy, and I had to try cases. And I can tell you that a document does not speak for itself. You cannot introduce a document into a court for consideration as evidence unless you have a witness that can authenticate the document and who can testify as to the meaning of its contents. Now, what the idea of a document speaks for itself really goes to contract law, where the witness can't change the plain meaning of the contract just by testifying. But sometimes there are ambiguities in the contract. You need a witness to say, well, what was the context of this? So people who criticize Joseph Smith for being a philanderer or a person who liked brass bands and orgasms, and there's all kinds of things that are said about him that are nasty. Well, my feeling is, okay, it's possible that he had these problems. I'm not saying that's impossible. But if you're going to prove it to me, it can't be based on, I have to cross-examine the witnesses for and against him. I have to understand their mentality, what the background. And anybody who watches courtroom dramas on television knows that they can dramatize, but I've seen it actually happen in court where cross-examination reveals an aspect of the case that you suddenly realize changes the whole understanding of what's going on. And so when historians, particularly Mormon historians, that eliminate entirely the possibility of the supernatural or the spiritual, and who are strictly physicalists, I feel like the more physicalist you are, the more you must insist on uncertainty, because you can't cross-examine the dead. And your conclusions have to be tentative. So when people say, Joseph Smith was a philanderer, he married somebody like Helen Mar Kimball, who was 14 or so. She was the daughter of Heber C. Kimball, who was a leading apostle. You have to ask, well, was this Heber C. Kimball's idea because he wanted to be connected to Joseph Smith through the marriage of his daughter to Joseph Smith? How do we know that? We have to cross-examine them. Was Helen Mar Kimball against polygamy? Or did she just didn't want to marry a 38-year-old? But what's going on? So if you're looking at these historical things that happened, I don't think you can come to firm conclusions. So again, the imagination, history is an imaginative project. It's tied to artifacts and documents and that. But remember, the documents and the artifacts don't speak for themselves. And it would be, it would be nice to have some of those Egyptian priests to tell us what those hieroglyphics really meant and what the pyramids were really for. It would have been nice to be able to cross-examine them, but we can't. And it's the same. The past even 150 years ago or 200 years ago, it's very hard to reconstruct without
Mm.
the ability to, the historians do a great job. They work hard.
Yeah.
But I'm
You can
saying that
get, it's hard work, but you can never be totally sure about everything, Yeah. So I
motivations.
think, yeah. So what I'm hearing here then is that what you were saying earlier just really rang a bell when I said, well, how does that apply to Mormonism? And like, it's really obvious that we have so many things taught in the LDS Church that are complete fantasy, that are not rooted in documentary or any other evidence. And there was a really interesting sort of little snippet going around in ex-Mormon Reddit the last couple of days of a kind of a style guide that had been given to, I think, academics, maybe at BYU Idaho. Everyone at Provo was denying they ever had it, but certainly to people who are going to be writing for the church about things. And it included a statement: if you're quoting Joseph Smith, please do not quote from the book Teachings of Joseph Smith that was edited by whoever, probably Joseph Fielding Smith or whoever, um, which I've got on my shelf. Please refer to the recent Joseph Smith teaching manual, from when they were doing it in Priesthood and Religious Society, because we're more sure about those quotes being accurate. The earlier version, actually, Joseph Smith didn't say a lot of those things, or some of them, and it's not as credible. So use recent sources, because we've done the work. The historians, in other words, have done the work to fact check them a bit more carefully. So there is this whole process going on within Mormonism where understanding of history and interpreting it and the lies told about it has been one of the major drivers for people becoming disillusioned and leaving. The Gospel Topics essays came out and basically admitted, 80% of what my generation were told was false anti-Mormon lies, and we were told to teach that on our missions and to anyone else who asked, and as teachers on a Sunday and as seminary teachers. No, that's not true. But then it turns out it was, after all. And that was an existential shock, because when your religion is proclaiming to be the ultimate truth and the most reliable source of information, and you then discover actually the church's own materials authorized by committees of apostles and general authorities at some point in their crazy bureaucracy, not necessarily written by the hand of the prophet as we used to feel, might not be reliable, and or might be less reliable than the secular historical records that criticize the church, that we've been told are anti-Mormon propaganda. So that then is a classic case of the price that everyone pays for going for fantasy, for prioritizing, rather than doing your best as an imaginaire, as a thinker, to understand history and make things make sense, but keep an open mind and to fact check very thoroughly every opportunity you get. If you just go with the fairy tale, the fantasy, the illusion, the rose-tinted story, the faith-promoting blah blah blah, you're going to set yourself up for a disaster. You don't get away with it in the information age. People used to get away with it quite a lot because you couldn't check, but now you can. There's the whole world of the polygamy deniers now, the Hemlock Knots people and so on, who are really basically McConkie Mormons not coping with the new history revealing what really went on with Joseph Smith, and they'd rather hold on to their fantasy. And they will be making the same arguments. They'll be saying, actually, the documentary evidence is sparse, that Joseph Smith was this philandering polygamizer, that therefore we should be skeptical about it. And ironically, using the same arguments that actually undermine most of their other beliefs. But this is the battlefield that a thinking Latter-day Saint exists in now. The church has changed its narrative radically within our own lifetimes, how it's still making changes and tweaking. They've suddenly released these stories of cartoons with the little captions for children about church history, ready for the Doctrine and Covenants and church history curriculum next year, which absolutely gaslight and lie about the racism and particularly Joseph Smith's polygamy. But at least they're introducing the fact that Joseph Smith had more than one wife to the children, after decades of being criticized for not doing that. The internet is all a kerfuffle, and there have been some hilarious additional panels to add to tell the real story of what went on. with these situations, with poor Joseph and Emma agonizing. Joseph really was terribly reluctant to be a polygamist and had to swallow the bitter pill, poor man. So that has again kicked off the kind of kerfuffle that always happens with the release of the latest edition of the Joseph Smith Papers, or something like the Gospel Topics, or a new institute manual about church history that usually involves some major gaslighting about something or other. So to know what the truth is and how to handle it and how to sift all these different voices is absolutely a requirement now if you're an even halfway informed Latter-day Saint, or even if you're not, if your kids are and they're leaving because of this stuff or asking you difficult questions. If you've got any sense, you have to unfortunately engage with all of this and come up with some kind of sense of things. And I'll just finish my little spiel here with a church today. We had the usual thing, doing the Come Follow Me curriculum, and we had, it's coming to the end, so we're doing Moroni, and they've got these movies now. So they had General Authority looking Moroni in a sort of Mayan-ish mound builder church with his little small congregation, and they recreated some of his teachings from the book of, or it might have been Mormon actually teaching, sorry, as recorded in Moroni. And they had his dutiful scribe writing these things down in what looked like a notebook that they probably didn't have in their culture, but hey, which I presume was Moroni writing down what his dad said. It was quite fun. It was a bit like watching Jesus of Nazareth, where they have a narrative in which Jesus gets to his parables and there's context and so on. That amazing movie. But I'm sitting there and I had a little chat with one of my friends afterwards about it. And in it, you've got that going on. So it's making assumptions about cultural context and a fantasy about how Mormon said these things, and the situation where Moroni wrote them down to quote later in his book. You've got, there's so much assumption there. But where do you begin if you want to make a movie of the Book of Mormon? You have to kind of make some creative choices. So they're imagining how could this have worked out? But at the same time, it's the bits where he quotes huge chunks of Paul's letters in Corinthians about charity, word for word from the King James Bible. So that would completely go over your head unless you are aware this is a controversy and an anachronism in the Book of Mormon, that verbatim huge chunks of the Tudor King James Version translation of the Bible is being spoken by ancient Mayan people in a completely different social and religious context, and that this is a major problem. But our teacher, is conscious, I think, of some of these issues. He certainly, he is quite informed about what's going on in the blog anacle, and he got in there just as part of the normal flow. Almost immediately afterwards, the most important thing is focusing on Jesus Christ and his atonement. Don't worry about all these distractions and these other and he talked about all the confusing voices out there, this big narrative they keep going for. How could you possibly work out what to believe with all these voices in social media telling you lots and lots of contradictory things? And ultimately, it's fear mongering to make sure no one goes anywhere near it or even tries, rather than here's how to navigate it, because you have to if you're going to live in this real world. So I'm watching this gaslighting happening, and it is the fantasy. You've got the fantasy reconstruction of what actually went on there. And then you've got, okay, we just told you all this stuff matters. And oh yeah, one of the things taught was a clear sign that you have real faith and God is with you is you must have regular visits from angels and be able to perform miracles. And my teacher is lovely. He tries to involve me, even though I'm an apostate excommunicant, and he has me writing on the board, doing the chalk lists. So I was writing all this list of what everyone was calling out of what they're saying, and it's like, there it is, angels visiting, miracles. And in my head, I've got all these post-Mormon narratives, like, well, the last time, and I said this to my friend, when was the last time any general authority actually said, I got visited by an angel? And is it sooner than nearly 200 years ago? In which case, clearly, we don't meet that criteria for having real faith. Where are the miracles? Where are people healing people? Where's the big it's obvious someone just had their arm put back on, miracle, not happening. But instead we've got general conference talks with the general conference death march. RFM talks about of endless people dying after having a blessing, and the faith not to be healed being taught by David Bednar. Just the lame excuses we used to say were the definition of apostasy. So all of that's in the Come Follow Me lesson for adults today, this morning at church. Anachronisms stating that we must, if we're not having visitations from angels, then we don't have the true religion. Immediate gaslighting, never mind all that. The only thing that matters is loving people and Jesus. So I just wanted to share that as where this is happening in real life on the ground in every ward. That this tension between the imagination, the fantasy, the making up what matters or what should count or what you're allowed to think about any of it. You know, this isn't just highfalutin Peter and Paul, the intellectuals, waffling on in their self-congratulatory podcast about their own brains. This is raw. This is what's happening every Sunday in every gospel doctrine lesson. What is real? The missionary video used to ask. What the flipping Nora is real here? How do we disentangle the fantasies of all these people and how they spin it and what is in the scriptures and interpret it? It's a messy business, but I guess our message is, sorry folks, you're just going to have to give it a try, and it might not be as hard as you think, but you're going to have to extend some brain power to
Well,
try and disentangle that.
one of the problems that we have is that since Descartes was born in 1599, the scientific method has had hundreds of years to flesh out so that we, scientists understand the process of hypothesis and experiment and cause and effect and using mathematical models and doing their experiments in a way that really zero in on what's happening. I mean, that's taken hundreds of years to work out. It didn't happen overnight. But a similar process of trying to understand what the scriptures mean and what Christ meant and how to deal with it has not been worked out. So what you have going on is that people who are not, literary types, who aren't used to words, who aren't used to looking at texts and close reading, and not used to having, dealing with translations from, languages like Greek and Hebrew, and trying to understand what was the original intention and how should it be interpreted in light of everything else that was said. We haven't come up with a methodology for doing that very well. Methodologies have developed, but some of them are not very hopeful, like, the ones where, you try to find the historical Jesus and just eliminate all the miracles and anything that was spiritual, and you just have rabbinical teaching. And fine. But I'm saying that in Mormonism, we certainly haven't come up with anything like that, a way of thinking. And this reminds me, I'm going to end this segment with a little story so we can go on to the next segment. But when I was at BYU, I was an Aaronic priesthood leader back many centuries ago, seems like now. And one of the priests in my quorum, in the Aaronic priesthood quorum, was L. Tom Perry's son, Lee. And we got to be quite good friends. And I think I got him to give up his errant ways, which weren't very errant. A good guy. And he went on a mission to Japan. And by the time he was coming home from his mission, I had finished my master's degree at BYU and had been hired from being on the communications faculty at BYU briefly. And I was hired to work as an associate editor of the Ensign magazine under Jay Todd. And while I was there, Jay came up with the idea that he wanted to have a series called Saints Around the World. And he asked me whether I would write the first of these articles of Saints Around the World and send me to Boston to do an article called The Boston Saints. And so I flew to Boston and stayed at the home of L. Tom Perry, Lee's dad, when L. Tom Perry was the president of the stake. And I was interviewing all kinds of people back there for my article, including Paul Thompson, other notable Mormons that were there. And anyway, Lee got back from his mission on that same weekend that I happened to be staying there. It was very coincidental. And we had a nice reunion, and I met his mom before she died, and his dad was there, the stake president, L. Tom Perry, and who worked for Lehman Brothers. And as I was leaving, I had this, I don't know why I did this. To this day, I don't know why. I was talking to Tom Perry in his office there, in his home office. And I said, I just have this feeling that I'm going to tell you this, but I don't know, I'm crazy, but I think you're going to be called to be an assistant to the 12. And I'm just telling you, I have this strong impression. And so I flew back to Salt Lake and I continued my work. I wrote the article. And in October of that year, Tom Perry was called to be an assistant to the 12. And the Ensign offices, they hadn't been moved to the newly constructed tall church office building that's, I don't know, 26 stories high. And we had, the Ensign was still in the commercial building that was on First South and off State Street there, and it was in a different building. And we had not yet moved to the 23rd floor of the new church office building, but we were scheduled to do that. And
Which I've been to. And before my mission, I stayed with some friends of my parents from BYU who worked there. And so he took me to his office, and then he took me up to meet the Ensign team and the people working on the graphic design, because he knew I was an artist. That was a really cool experience. And looking out of the window at that incredible view over
on the 23rd
Salt Lake
floor of the
City
real
was
building.
brilliant.
We weren't there yet.
Yeah.
So I was working in this other building. They hadn't moved. And the secretary, the front receptionist at the front desk, comes running back and she says, L. Tom Perry is here to see you. And I said, what? He had just been called as an assistant to the 12, just, that. So I said, well, don't have him wait, So he came into my office and sat down, and I said, well, it's good to see you again, Elder Perry. I'm glad that, and congratulations on your, you called as a general authority. He said, how did you know? Who told you? And I said, well, nobody told me. I have no inside information here. I'm a low-level functionary at the Ensign. And so I just didn't know how. But I'll tell you how I feel again with you here, that next year you're going to be called to be into the 12. You'll be an apostle.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you.
And
you've got a good track record so far.
He was stunned. And so he left, and next year he was called as an apostle. And I went up to his house in the up by the Capitol for dinner. With Lee was there, and Lee's sister, whose name I can't remember right now, was there. Their mother had passed away by this time, so L. Tom Perry was a widower. And he had come back. He looked a little tired, but I was talking to him. And I said, what do you talk about in the Council of the 12? I mean, do you talk about religion or theology or, any of these issues that bother the minds of Latter-day Saints in Sunday school, He said, oh, no, we don't have time for that. We barely can get through our agenda of just dealing with the business of the church, figuring out stuff in the church. So we never, besides, he said, I don't think we could, we would have probably different opinions about those things. And so we don't want to get into that territory.
Open that can of worms.
Open that can of worms. And so, they don't want to be theologians. They prefer to be real estate agents and managers of property and investments, because theology,
it's much safer.
We don't have a mechanism to deal with theology because we don't know how to deal with revelation. The church is based on continuing revelation, and we have no idea how to deal or recognize or interpret or cope with revelations, whether they be visitations from Jesus or synchronicities. And that gets us into our next section.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So, and you said earlier about how how we don't have a methodology for deciding how to interpret scripture, in effect, how to decide what the truth is. I would say that there is a potential one, which has been very important to me in my podcast, which is the common consent. There's this amazing paragraph in one of the Institute manuals about common consent with no quotes. So it was just stated that common consent should apply to everything that's done in the church, including policies. And if that was actually practiced, I think you have the beginning of a fairly robust mechanism there. If you can convince the bulk of the membership and they can seek a spiritual or intellectual confirmation, you then get that hive mind of collective wisdom to say, yeah, I think this is probably the best way to go with this. And one of the great messages of the Mormon scriptures is democracy. That the Polar Great Price, as I've said before, teaches that God runs heaven as a democracy. The war in heaven was an argument of ideas followed by a vote. You made a choice. And Book of Mormon teaches democracy in the ideal for the Old Testament was kind of the judges, which was kind of their healthiest government before they end up being corrupted by their kings, which Samuel made very clear was a step backwards, where you had leaders who emerged based on their actual skill set, not their ancestry. And the Book of Mormon is very clear with that transition from the sons of Mosiah refusing to inherit the throne and wanting to go off and be missionaries. So they became an elected republic of some kind with chief judges. And with that, the message that the voice of the people will mostly choose well. And if they choose bad, that's their own fault, but at least it's on their own heads, not something imposed upon them by corrupt kings. And then the Doctrine and Covenants teaches extremely strongly that democracy is meant to be fundamental to how the church functions. This idea that we're meant to be some dictatorial theocracy is complete nonsense, contradicts the Doctrine and Covenants. Very clear instructions about accountability, that any bishop can convene a council of high priests to put the president of the church on trial if needed. And it says specifically because he is not above the rules that everyone else should be following. And you should have common consent votes for every major decision. So I would say there is a system, and it is harnessing the best that we can come up with our imaginations, our informed imagination, which seems to be what you're advocating for, that we come up with the best ideas we can based on the information we have available after making the effort to research and get that information is kind of the way forward, and the only hope for governments as well as for the church or any organization that wants to be healthy and not stagnate. And we've got to resist the fantasies. We've got to resist the illusion that you can have a God King who's 100 years old, who knows better than all of you, and all the other kinds of faith promoting fantasies that end up breaking faith because they create trust and belief in things that aren't actually true. And therefore, when you find out they're not true, your faith is gone. So I think this has turned out to be a really interesting theme, that difference between the best we can do is imagine, and we're trying to understand what truth is, but it's too much to say, I know the truth unequivocally. But that's still a massive step up from just believing in fantasies with no credible evidence, rational or evidential, to support them. So our next theme is, sorry, remind me. I'm
Well,
getting my
let's
phone
take the
open
next
again.
two together, which are revelation
Yeah.
from insight to theophany and also visionary texts, because they're really related.
Yeah, cool. Let's do it. All right. Thank you. We'll see you again soon, everybody. Next installment tomorrow. If you'll bear with me, I'd like to conclude this episode with a few minutes of reflection on what Paul was saying here has meant to me, particularly his statement earlier on that, quote, theology can't save us, love saves us, close quote. This sounds like a hippie Beatles song lyric or something you read in a motivational thought for the day meme. But I think it has a lot of heft and depth to it too. It expresses the whole point of my Pharisee versus Christianity Mormon Civil War podcast in a nutshell. Obsessing about specific truth claims as LDS leaders and members do, along with the devoted leaders and members of every religion, leads inevitably to extreme thought control and doctrine policing and tone policing, getting tangled up in conflicting beliefs about what God is and what God wants from you, until you make it incredibly hard to be considered faithful, kosher, acceptable, exactly obedient on the true covenant path in the true church. It leads to a state of affairs where to join your religion, people have to sign up to a huge body of specific knowledge and use the correct language in the correct way with the correct meaning in order to fit in and be considered trustworthy, one of us, and truly welcome in that community. Not surprisingly, hardly anyone is willing to go through all that to join you in the first place, especially if they are educated and doing well in their careers and family life, rather than lonely and desperate in some tragic way. And once in, as one of the very few people who agree to be baptized and become a member, you have to continue to believe, think, say, and do all the right things in exactly the same way to maintain your insider status as a trusted and welcome person in that belief system and community. But it is inevitable that as soon as you start to get exhausted by it all, or express any differences of opinion to the consensus, or dare to point out that some of the truth claims and cultural norms are factually wrong, or overclaiming, or do not deliver on the promises they make, or are assertively harmful, you are met with a withdrawal of that trust. Then, before long, that distrust becomes open hostility, people trying so hard to maintain this fragile edifice of conformity in which their own identities have become completely curated and controlled by the religion and all the overt and subtle expectations of its culture, hit the panic button. You become their most dangerous enemy after once being welcomed as their brother or sister. So huge numbers of people not able or willing to be conforming robots are made to feel unwelcome and that they do not belong within this community, and they drop out of participation. This is why the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in choosing to be a highly controlling, high-demand, fundamentalist religion that now practices with enthusiasm nearly all the characteristics on any list you can find about how to identify a harmful cult, has always struggled to retain its converts and children for long. The final straw has been the internet, revealing since the 1990s how intentional and deceptive this machine of thought control in the LDS Church has been all along. In their panic about collapsing membership, the church's leaders have been throwing everything at the wall and hoping something sticks. Doubling down on thought control, reluctantly experimenting with more honesty, while at the same time sabotaging that totally by refusing to admit their own mistakes or apologize and repent for them. Hoarding vast wealth instead of spending it to save the dying church, or hire experts to rescue their incompetent amateur teaching materials and ministering programs. They have chopped up and cut down the Sunday meetings and the temple ordinances, yet somehow made them even more boring and tedious. And in their staggering pride and hubris, the general authorities and their unquestioning local parrots blame everyone but themselves for their failures, blaming the world in general, blaming the social media corporations they have spent a fortune buying shares in with tithing money, blaming the youth of today, while at the same time claiming the youth of today are the Saturday's warriors, the noble and spiritually strong, blaming the members for being lazy learners and lax disciples. So what I loved about this episode and the points Paul Toscano was making is that a church's approach to theology has a direct impact on the lived experience and culture of ordinary participants. This was one of the clearest messages Jesus taught repeatedly in his ministry, to reform what the Pharisees and temple priests and Sadducees had done to Judaism. He reminded them that ultimately what God wants is unconditional, self-sacrificial care and love for every person, regardless of their insider or outsider status or their sins. As soon as you prioritize your dogma, your rules, your cultural norms over welcoming and loving and accepting even the least of the people on earth, your faithfulness and righteousness and obedience to commandments doesn't count for anything. You have entirely missed the point, and Jesus doesn't know you. You are not on his team. As Jesus put it in a handy couplet, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. As Paul Toscano put it, theology can't save us. Love saves us. Having been raised from birth in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by very faithful parents, it has taken me decades to fully recognize just how far the Church has strayed from these basic principles, even though it taught them to me as words. I was shown incredible amounts of devoted man and woman hours of love and care and patience and service by the members of my church community, along with the 80% of my peers and the converts whose baptisms I attended or performed who have left. But that love was nearly all highly conditional upon our conformity and willingness to give the community our psychological priority, most of our available waking hours, and most of our money after tax and living expenses. That's what high demand and fundamentalist means, and what it looks like in a person's life. And it simply doesn't work. We were promised that if we worked and gave that hard, our wards would be stakes by now, teeming with thousands of members. They aren't. They are shrinking back to branch size and being closed and merged to survive a little longer. LDS parents throughout the 20th century were promised that if we put the religion first in everything we did, our children would grow up faithful in it and not stray far. This was a lie. The vast majority of the people who did that have seen some or all of their children and grandchildren reject their religion. 80% of kids raised in the church now leave before age 25. And the remaining active remnants are choosing to forget that those promises were ever made to them. So it turns out Jesus and the Mormons like Margaret and Paul Toscano advocating for a tolerant, inclusive, big tent Mormonism were right all along. Where people are free, with free access to information, fundamentalism and the priorities of the Pharisee approach to religion fail. It fails to thrive. It fails to retain its own children. It fails to convert the world or make it significantly better. The comforting trope active members, especially in social media, keep trotting out, that it is the strict, bigoted, fundamentalist religions that keep their members and grow, has been proven to be a lie. They are losing members just as fast as everyone else now that the internet has neutralized their cult, thought control, and manipulation mechanisms. It just took a bit longer for their members to deconstruct the more intense fundamentalist brainwashing they had received than the people in the more liberal denominations that lost their members first. So, once that crust of thought control tactics has been scraped away, any religion that wants to survive the next few decades is going to have to revisit and reform the fundamentals of its truth claims and have credible things to say about their gods and what their gods want from us or are offering us. This is theology. Paul Toscano, as an often lone voice in Mormonism, has devoted his life to reminding us of that, while most of us have been quite rightly focused on the day-to-day struggle to challenge and defeat the mountain of lies and what Dieter Uchtdorf called the mountain of sediment crushing the precious flower of the gospel of Jesus Christ in his October 2015 General Conference talk titled, "It Works Wonderfully."
Are we making our discipleship too complicated? This beautiful gospel is so simple a child can grasp it, yet so profound and complex that it will take a lifetime, even an eternity, of study and discovery to fully understand it. But sometimes we take the beautiful lily of God's truth and gild it with layers upon layers of man-made good ideas, programs, and expectations. Each one by itself might be helpful and appropriate for a certain time and circumstance. But when they are laid on top of each other, they can create a mountain of sediment that becomes so thick and heavy that we risk losing sight of that precious flower we once loved so dearly. Therefore, as leaders, we must strictly protect the church and the gospel in its purity and plainness and avoid putting unnecessary burdens on our members. And all of us, as members of the church, we need to make a conscientious effort to devote our energy and time to the things that truly matter, while uplifting our fellow man and building the kingdom of God.
Now that the long war against lies and harmful authoritarian control is being won so decisively, and the educated and informed are running away from the religions and churches, if Latter-day Saints want anyone to continue to join their church in the future, or to have the people being freed from their mental chains still engage with religion as part of their life, they will need to increasingly address these gaping holes in our theology that have been neglected by the LDS leadership for over a century now. Most of the more mature Christian denominations have been using those decades to engage with a steep learning curve in how to adjust to developments in biblical scholarship, the theory of evolution, and the psychology of religion. It was embarrassing that as a returned missionary, having hours-long discussions with my fellow university student Steve, the born-again Christian, he was educating me about hermeneutics, the science of interpreting written texts, and early Christian history. Mormonism got lucky and had enough going for it then to win his heart and mind and conversion. But I was discovering that in years of intense seminary lessons and study, there were huge gaps in what we were taught by the church about theology and epistemology, the philosophy of how you determine what is true. So I hope these conversations with Paul are sparking an interest in church members to get stuck in and recognize how much theology matters for them personally and for the survival of their religion now they have so little time left to reform and save it. When you have abandoned lying, withholding information from investigators, and high-pressure sales techniques as a missionary, and you are standing there naked with just your theology to offer ordinary people, do you really have a clear and credible religion to offer them when your church can't even work out which Godhead it worships or created which bits of the universe? Is it the Godhead of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, which is referenced in a baptism? Is it the Godhead of Elohim, Jehovah, and Michael, who create the solar system and life on earth in the temple endowment? Is it the Godhead of the eternally married husband and wife, or plural wives, and their firstborn son, described in the marriage manuals and the family proclamation? Is it the Godhead of Adam and Eve and Jehovah in Brigham Young's original version of the temple endowment? Or the feminist Mormons' Godhead of Father, Son, and Heavenly Mother in disguise as the Holy Ghost? You have a lot to sort out, And since time is running out, I suggest you get on with it sooner rather than later, or you will miss the small window of opportunity to have something believable to offer before you run out of missionaries and run out of chapels near enough to get to in your own community. Hang on a minute. How have I gone from saying theology cannot save you to pleading with Mormons to realize that they desperately need to get better at theology to save their religion? I guess it does matter a lot. If the theology you have come up with is self-contradictory and a fantasy disconnected from our instincts to have compassion for everyone and want to welcome and include them all in our religion, then theology gets in the way of love. It makes you blind to your own hypocrisy and the suffering of others, as Jesus taught. It becomes a, quote, stumbling block, close quote, preventing you from converting the world, as the Apostle Paul taught. So, in the spirit of an evolving rational faith, I will adjust what I'm believing and saying to be more specific. Theology can't be ignored if you want to run a religion. So make sure it is a theology that is an expression of love and equality for everyone, rather than an obstacle to that, or you can kiss your congregation goodbye. And for the rest of us, I hope these dialogues are feeding your intellect and soul in ways that are helpful and meaningful for you too. Even if only to reassure you that love really is far more important in your life than any of this theological waffle. More tomorrow as we dive into Revelation, Insight to Theophany.